This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 128, entitled MGTOW/Masculism Now Penetrating the Mainstream Media. Description. This flyer gives the link to a BBC radio interview of British MGTOWs, the first of its kind, as far as I know. However, now remember I was writing this 1-2 years ago. They've been on a lot more since. However, I felt it lacked punch, so I put into this flyer what I would have said if I had been interviewed. Now, the flyer itself. MGTOW/Masculism now penetrating the mainstream media. This link, and I'll give it to you now, or you can just click on it in the text of this flyer. The link is www.bbc.co.uk/programs, that's MES/B, the letter, 072MQ8, the number, S. Is, as far as I know, the first important mainstream media documentary on the MGTOW movement. It was made by the BBC as a radio program, interviewing a handful of MGTOWs in the UK. The interviewer was obviously rather cynical, but at least the interviewees got a chance to air some of their opinions to the masses, the millions. That BBC radio interview is now up on YouTube, so it can be spread all over the world, except where I live, in China, which has a government which censors YouTube to keep the Chinese population from being infected by the, quote, democracy, freedom of speech virus, end quote. That would, quote, undermine the stability of society, end quote, which is CCP speak for throwing out the one-party dictatorship that has killed 80 million of its own citizens under Mao Zedong and continues to rob the people massively. I consider this interview to be a bit of history, and have been putting up its link on a daily basis to Sandman's and TFM, that's Toad Flinging Monkey. These are well-known content producers of MGTOW ideas on YouTube, so that many MGTOW/Masculists can listen to it, as well as for other journalists who may be inspired to make similar interviews. However, it was not a good interview in my opinion. If I'd been interviewed, it would have been a lot more forceful and persuasive. The interviewer was quite a male feminist and largely ignorant of MGTOW/Masculist ideas, so I would have appealed to his self-interest with the most forceful of MGTOW/Masculist arguments that he as the male could hardly deny. I hope in future media interviews that the MGTOW/Masculists being interviewed will be influenced by my suggestions below and make a much stronger case for MGTOW/Masculism that really turns the journalists' heads, converting them into MGTOW/Masculists, sympathisers. Here's what I would have said. You sound as though you're a bit of a male feminist, which is understandable. You've had decades to absorb the feminist message. You have not yet absorbed the MGTOW/Masculist message. You can make an analogy that the men's lib movement, MGTOW/Masculist, is just getting off the ground now with the first media interviews, so is where second wave feminism was in the late 60s. If you want to know why now, what has caused the rise of MGTOW/Masculism now rather than decades ago? The main answer is that MGTOW/Masculism is largely a reaction by men to the toxicity of divorce and hence marriage, due to the takeover of the divorce courts by the fluffy feminists, causing roughly 1 married father in 4 in the US to be financially massacred. A divorcing man will lose his kids, his house, so that his fluffy ex-wife can have it to raise her kids in. He'll be forced by the divorce courts to pay child support to kids he'll barely see. And if the ex-wife is a fluffy, he may have to pay her alimony so that she can remain parasiting on his money after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. With these horrific odds of 1 in 4, it's not surprising that in the US and Japan now, 2/3, 70% of young men refuse to marry and refuse to have kids, spending their money on themselves. This refusal of paternity is the most important phenomenon of our times because, do the math, It means that whole populations get wiped out in a mere century, that is 4 generations. So with the young generation reproducing only a third of their number, that's a third of a third of a third of a third, that's about 1%. So men have gone on a man strike. They refuse to be manslaves to women. Masculists, that's men's livers, the obvious male equivalent to the word feminist, state that their major political goal is to wipe out fluffies, that is, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money of a man. Not by killing them, but simply refusing to have anything to do with them, forcing them to rot on the shelf to extinction. MGTOW/Masculists will have relationships with women, but only if the women are FIPs, that's financially independent persons, who have bothered to get a career-competent education, that is STEM, STEM, science, tech, engineering, math major, and the professions, so that they can be career-competent, financially responsible adults and not parasite off a man in her 30s when her biological clock is ticking hard and she realizes she cannot afford to buy a middle-class house to raise her kids in due to her fluffy crap diploma. So she starts looking around for some manslave dupe who has not had his men's consciousness raised to pay for her kids, and for the house that a decade later she will steal from him via the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts. Fluffies are the enemy of the masculists. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on fluffies to be FIP or they won't get a man. In quotes, be FIP or be manless. Quote, no calculus, no baby. If a woman is a fluffy and manless, she will be loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and increasingly shunned by a society that is becoming ever more in agreement with masculists, who label fluffies as immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out. Masculists are in the 21st century what Northern Americans were in the 19th century, that is, abolitionists against Negro slavery. Manslavery is slavery. Slavery is a war issue, and the masculists are at war against the fluffies, aiming to wipe them out in order to create a FIP society. Masculists are more politically oriented than MGTOWs, men going their own way. MGTOWs usually just walk away passively from the marriage market, refusing marriage and paternity. Masculists are often MGTOWs, but push for political change. Masculists push the journalists and the gender politicians to amend further gender laws, or the MGTOW/Masculists will continue the paternity strike and wipe out whole populations. This threat of wiping out whole populations is very powerful and will obviously force the gender politicians to amend further gender laws, for example in the divorce courts, making custody of children joint by default, throwing out alimony, promoting the idea that the divorcing couple buy a cheap apartment near the house that they alternate in, e.g. in 1 week the father's in the apartment while the mother is in the house with the kids, and the next week the two parents swap places. Masculists have a whole list of legal discriminations against men that need to be systematically eradicated from the planet. One of the biggest is the lack of the PARA, paternity rejection right. That is, the right of a man to reject unwanted paternity. Women have had a MARA since the 70s, thanks to political pressure from the second wave feminists. Men have no such equivalent right, so can have their lives ruined when their wives/girlfriends lie to them about taking the pill and getting accidentally, in parentheses, on purpose, pregnant, and then forcing a paternity suit on the man. The lack of the PARA is a blatant example of sexual discrimination against men, and this lack is one of the many reasons why masculists are so insistent on women becoming FIPs, so that if a FIP woman gets pregnant and the father rejects paternity, she can go ahead with the pregnancy if she wants, but she gets full financial legal responsibility for the costs of the kid. The second wave feminists were mostly sages, that is intellectuals, who made reasonable demands, e.g. equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, the MARA, abortion right, etc. It would be sorry, my voice is going. I would be a male, second wave feminist, just because of my liberal nature. I saw such things as fair, but that was half a century ago. Today's third wave feminists are mostly peakers, people of average ability lying in the peak of the bell curve, who are out and out ginocrats. They are hypocrites who want equal rights, but reject equal obligations, that is, sharing the burden of earning the living by becoming FIPs, getting a FIP education, but so not studying fluffy crap. These fluffy feminists don't give a shit about the ex-husbands they financially massacre in the divorce courts, even holding divorce parties after they get his money, feeling no moral obligation to be a FIP and a morally responsible adult. So, given this childlike behaviour of the fluffies in the divorce courts, men are on strike, and the masculists are pointing the finger at these fluffies, saying that, quote, "If you women don't FIP up, you'll be punished." Men are mostly FIPs, so have the power to force women to be FIPs. A fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into a manslave. But the supply of such gullible, ignorant men is drying up. Already 70% of young men under 35 in the US and Japan reject the traditional manslave role of the man working for a woman. This is why fluffies are shitting in their pants, because they feel profoundly threatened. The man strike will force them to become adults, to take responsibility for their own lives. They will have to be FIPs and get a FIP major, STEM, or professions, education. But having all women being FIPs will not stop the man strike. The gender politicians still have to men-fair the gender laws. MGTOW/Masculists will continue to reject paternity until that happens. In the meantime, men still want sex from a woman, so many of them will adopt a lifestyle that does not involve the traditional cost of getting regular sex from a woman, that is, being her manslave. This lifestyle is called tway-tweffing, in parentheses 2A, 2F, equals 2 apartments, 2 FIPs. That is, both the man and the woman are FIPs and have their own apartment each. When a tway-tweff relationship fails, as nearly all do, the man just walks away, cost-free to him. There's no divorce, because no marriage, no child payments, because no kids, no house loss or alimony, because the woman is a FIP. The big plus of tway-tweffing for a man is that it keeps the woman being nice to him. No nagging, no withholding of sex, no female hysterics, because she knows that he can walk away so easily if she starts becoming a bitch. So she's always nice to him through fear of losing him so easily. The only thing holding a tway-tweff relationship together is the quality of the relationship. If that fails, it's over. MGTOWs teach that women don't love men. They only love men's exploitability. This is shown clearly in the divorce courts, where one married woman in 4 financially massacres her ex-husband and feels no guilt about it. Women evolved to be parasites on men. Women had to stay home with the infants and could not hunt, so were critically dependent on men to give them protein for them and their babies to survive. So they evolved to become the sexiest of all mammals, trading female sex for protein. They evolved to become prostitutes for men. MGTOWs also teach that women are hypergamous, that is, are genetically programmed to dump her current man for a more exploitable male, richer, taller, stronger, higher status, if a realistic opportunity comes along, that women have no loyalty to men, only to themselves and to their kids. To women, men are disposable, to be exploited for their resources. This bitter reality that is difficult for men to swallow is called the red pill by the MGTOWs, a term taken from the movie The Matrix. Masculists accept this Darwinian nature of women, but nevertheless claim that women can be forced to become responsible adult FIPs, otherwise they're punished by not getting a man. MGTOW/Masculism will become as important to society as was feminism. It will force women to take responsibility for their own lives, and it will force the gender politicians to men-fair the gender laws, or the MGTOW/Masculists will continue the paternity strike and, in capitals, wipe out whole populations. It's only a question of time before this critically important message is known to everyone. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. Ciao.